Now, for more on education across Africa, I'm joined by Emira Woods. She's an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies here in Washington. Welcome back to the show.
Great to be with you, always.
So for people who are trying to get an understanding of the educational systems across Africa, how would you describe the current state of them?
Mixed. You have some places where education is really leapfrogging, particularly in places like South Africa, certainly Nigeria. There are a number of countries that have prioritized education, need to still spend more in terms of actual dollars and percentages of their budget on education, but they're going in the right direction. And I think that it's critical because it is public education that holds the answer for the majority of the population on the continent. A population that is young, is demographic that is hungry to be engaged in tech, in innovation, in building the future Africa that we all know is possible, right? So I think it is investing in public education that is critical. But we do have also in the continent, in some countries that are actually stepping away from support for public education, privatizing even their public education system is being privatized, and really, I think, putting at risk some of the serious gains of the past decades in public schooling, where basic education, elementary, up through high school, up through college, free for all, right? I think you've got some countries that are not quite in step with the push, understanding that education is a right that all must be able to exercise, whether they're in rural or urban areas on the continent.
Now, you mentioned you have the public funding and you also have the private funding. Tell us, for better or worse, about the sort of role that the private sector is playing in education across the continent.
Well, there's some that are positive, we have to say. Well, some of the coding schools that you see there, some are being privately run, but for the most part, you also have some international investors that are in these privatized schemes that are actually taking resources away from the public school system. So I think we've got to challenge those particularly the advances where you have these hedge funds that are coming in without a history in education, without a history in public education, that are then taking away school buildings, taking away school resources from the public school system. So the push to privatize public schools puts at risk an education system that was really founded on values of liberating a continent. But if you have an international investor really interested in their profits, and they may not be as committed to sort of a liberation model of education that particularly the post-colonial era has seen in many countries around the continent. So I think we've got to challenge those areas while also pushing some of the advances, particularly in science and technology.
Now let's talk about some of these advances. As you mentioned, this is the youngest population in the world that we have on this continent here, and so they obviously have the potential to reshape and in fact leapfrog some industries. But then you also have them worried about these traditional industries like agriculture, where perhaps young people might not be as interested. What are the fields that they are focusing on, and where should they be focusing?
I think science and technology is critical for the future, and you see across the continent this leapfrogging that's going on. I was recently in Arusha, Tanzania. This young 18-year-old has figured out a way to turn plastic bags into bricks, right? He just had turned 18 last month, right? So I think it is young people that are visioning new ways of doing things. They're coming from resource-poor environments, and their creativity is just without measure. And so I think it is creating opportunities for those types of visionary innovators, wherever they may be, to be able to have access to education, free, funded public education, to be able to also have support for their creativity, for science and technology and maker spaces, coding schools across the continent, to be available to young men, young women across the continent. And I think now we are increasingly seeing examples where women in tech throughout the continent are standing out as champions for change across the continent. They are developing the future, inventing the future, in those beautiful words of Thomas Sankara. So I think what we have to say is, more power to them. And let's figure out how the international community, both investors as well as governments that are interested in trading with Africa, that they too can support budgetary expenditures for public school education on the continent.
And in that same vein, we saw that at the recent Forum on China-Africa Cooperation that China pledged a number of educational partnerships, including 100,000 government scholarships and training opportunities, as well as educational exchanges. What do China and African countries have to gain from each other with these sorts of exchanges?
Exchanges are critical and scholarships are vital, and especially at a time when the U.S., because of all this issue with immigration, is clamping down on opportunities for students to come and study in the U.S., not granting visas for students to come and study. Even those who had visas are not getting their visas renewed. So really clamping down on opportunities for young people to access education. And so I think these scholarships from China, I think it's gone from, in 2003, an estimate about 2,000 to back in 2016, something like 160,000 scholarships, right? So I think these are steps in the right direction, but these are scholarships to individuals. And what Africa needs is support for public school education so that people in rural and urban areas have the opportunities for that basic education, math, science, those building blocks for the future. Those start in elementary school. They have to be free, they have to be available, and it has to be through public schooling.
All right, thank you so much. Always good to have you on. Emira Woods there from the Institute for Policy Studies.